But for our second snippet, there's one other big political, diplomatic, military effect of World War I, and that's the collapse of the Russian Empire and then the creation of the Russian Civil War and ultimately the Bolshevik triumph. Here's Vladimir Lenin, the leader of the Bolsheviks. Here's a map of Russia in 1918. Remember, the Russians pull out of the war a few months before the end of the conflict and negotiate this treaty with peace treaty with Germany, which is a very favorable treaty for the Germans. The Bolsheviks control central Russia, the areas that are here in yellow. But the areas in green are controlled by troops associated with the Allies, the British, the French, but also the Americans, who are assisting in this conflict. The whites, the whites are the anti-Bolshevik forces. Some of them are monarchists. They want to restore the Tsar. Some of them are Democrats. They want to create a social democratic government. Ostensibly, the Allies are participating in this conflict not because they want the Bolsheviks to lose. This is the real reason they're participating in it, but because they're saying they gave the Russian Empire lots of arms, and because the Russians have now pulled out of the war, they want to safeguard these weapons, be sure that they're not turned over to the Germans. Sort of, think of sort of what's the fate of American military supplies left behind in Afghanistan. This is the same kind of principle. This is a civil war where the Bolsheviks win in part because they are more ruthless than their opponents, but in part because their opponents are divided and are never able to move into the key parts of the country in Moscow and in St. Petersburg. For our purposes, the major effect of the Russian Civil War is Wilson's decision to send contingents of U.S. troops. This is the U.S. Army marching down a main street in Archangel in Murmansk in the northern part of Russia. But the U.S. never declares war against the Bolsheviks. It's not clear under what constitutional authority Wilson acted to send these troops. And unlike his earlier decisions, remember pre-entry into World War I, we looked at him into Haiti and the Dominican Republic, where he sent troops without a declaration of war. The decision to send troops into Russia arouses considerable congressional resistance. And the leader of the forces is this man, Hiram Johnson, who was a Republican, but kind of a liberalish, at least at this point in his career, Republican from California. And Johnson proposes an amendment to the military appropriations budget to strip from that budget all funds for the U.S. military intervention in the Russian Civil War. So that will basically force Wilson to withdraw the troops. The Johnson Amendment fails, but on a tie vote, the vice president has to cast the tie-breaking vote. And internally, the administration recognizes that Congress is just not going to continue to authorize funds. And so Wilson pulls out the troops. This was a disastrous move in all kinds of different ways. By the United States. Wilson doesn't send enough troops. He sends around 20,000 U.S. troops, not enough to influence the course of the war, but enough to arouse concerns about the constitutionality of the decision, and certainly enough to arouse the attentions of the Bolsheviks, who were never going to be pro-American in any respect, but become very, very strongly anti-American in response to the U.S. Intervention. Johnson's effort is part of a broader move in Congress to kind of rein in Wilson's very aggressive use of executive authority, which is helped by the fact that the Republicans take control of the Senate after the 1918 elections. They pick up from the Democrats all the states that I have here in dark red. The Democrats pick up one seat in Massachusetts, but the Democrats still would have had the Senate. It would have been a tie Senate, and the vice president would have cast the tie-breaking vote to give the Democrats the majority. But for this pink state here, Wisconsin, where there is a special election, the Democratic incumbent, this man, Paul Husting, whose seat was not supposed to be up in 1918. Husting goes home in 1917. There's a break in the Senate during World War I. He decides that he's going to go out and do some hunting. He's involved in a hunting accident and he dies. And his seat which would have been a Democratic seat, is picked up by the Republicans in a special election. So you hear a lot about these themes of historical inevitability, and in theory, there are some things that are likely to occur than not. But this is a very good reminder of the importance of contingency in U.S. foreign policy. If Husting doesn't go out hunting that day, he doesn't die. If he doesn't die, the Democrats retain control of the Senate in 1919. That means they control the Senate calendar. Wilson could have moved the League of Nations to the Senate floor very quickly. Instead, the new leader of the Senate, Henry Cabot Lodge, drags things out, requires that the treaty be read in its entirety, which consumes days, has extensive committee hearings, and the result is that opposition to the treaty builds over the course of the spring and summer of 1919 in a way that probably would not have occurred but for the fact that the Democrats don't have a Senate majority. There are factions all over the place in the Senate debate over the League, but a couple are worth talking about. The man on the left is James Reed, who was a Democratic senator from Missouri. He is the only Democratic consistent opponent of the League of Nations. The man on the right is William Borah, an important senator, Republican from Idaho. Reed and Borah don't want the U.S. involved in the League at all, but they're willing to compromise with moderate opponents of the League to at least bog things down in the hope that Wilson, who just says he doesn't want any sort of compromise at all, will wind up walking away, which is basically what happens. But their basic argument is, look, the United States has survived 130 years by this point, 140 years, as a country that did not form foreign alliances. We should not join the League of Nations. It's a bad idea. There's also a left-wing criticism of the League of Nations. These two men you may remember from one of the snippets previously. The guy on the left is Astley Grauner, a Republican senator from North Dakota. The guy on the right is George Norris, a Republican senator from Nebraska. They are left-wing Republicans. Both had crossed party lines in 1916 to endorse Wilson's reelection bid. And Wilson then carries North Dakota and Nebraska. So, they play a critical role in Wilson's reelection. But they split from Wilson on the decision to enter the war. Both of them cast votes against the war. And they're convinced that Wilson is going to create is seeking to create through the League an imperialist venue that will aid the colonial powers of Britain and France. And they turn to Article 11, which Wilson saw as a peacemaking move. These left-wing senators, called the Peace Progressives, they turn to Article 11. They see something very different than Wilson did. Wilson basically saw this as, if there's a crisis, this provision of the League of Nations covenant will allow any country who's in the League to bring it to the attention of the League, and maybe they'll get a diplomatic solution. The Peace Progressives say, look, what do you mean here by the friendly right of each member of the League? Let's assume, for instance, and this is one of the hypotheticals they raise, we have a situation where the French have been given a League of Nations mandate over Syria. There's an anti-imperialist revolution in Syria, and France, as a member of the League, calls this issue to the attention of League members, asking for League assistance. Well, Syria, which it would be a French colony, they wouldn't be a member of the League. So basically, what Norris and Grauner are saying is that the wording of Article 11 favors imperialist countries, favors colonial countries over the colonized people. Now, there's no evidence that Wilson ever intended Article 11 to work in this way, but it's not an illegitimate criticism, and it's part of this general left-wing suspicion of Wilson. So Wilson is faced with the problem here, is that he's kind of scrunched from the right, from the Henry Cabot Lodge types, and then there are these irreconcilables, people who want no business in the League, and then these left-wing peace progressives. And his general approach is no compromise, that the Senate just has to ratify what he brought back from Paris. That proves to be problematic for Wilson, and that's what we'll look at in our final snippet.